Welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. We are a monthly gathering of both believers and skeptics, respectfully discussing important books from both perspectives. My name is James Walker, and I'm one of the co-founders. I'm a Christian co-founder of the book club. Uh, I work with Watchman Fellowship, which is an evangelical Christian ministry. I'm an apologist, and our focus at Watchman Fellowship is on primarily on new religious movements and world religions, controversial doctrines, practices, cults, the occult. We deal in the area of everything from Islam to Wicca and Church of Scientology. But I have an interest in atheism as well, and especially the last 7 years since our book club got started, I've gotten a lot more interested in it and enjoy reading. We do alternate books. We'll do a Christian book one month, an atheist book the next month. And we are privileged to have an atheist guest author with us today. And we usually do have the author with us. His name is John W. Campbell. John is a lawyer and a magician. I don't know if the two work together in some cases, but a songwriter, photographer, video producer, adventure travel enthusiast, history buff, Renaissance man who lives with his family in the southern United States. John has been a trial lawyer for over 25 years, successfully handling cases throughout the country. He graduated from the College of William and Mary in Virginia and from the University of Arkansas, Little Rock, from the law school there. John was the co-author of a book on close-up magic called Pure Imagination. I told him earlier, right before we went on, I'd love to even talk about that, but I'm going to try to keep on topic here. Before writing his book, Cross-Examined, Putting Christianity on Trial, his dissection of Christianity in the case of apologists for the Christian God. John was raised in a Christian household, but lost his faith in college, ironically, in the process of trying to strengthen his faith. Since that time, he has a profound interest in religion, especially Christianity. As I shared earlier, John, I'm a former Mormon, and I'm a critic of Mormonism. So that what they always tell me, James, you can leave Mormonism, but you can't leave it alone. And so maybe you might fall in that category. So, John, welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club.
Thank you, James. I really appreciate it. I'd love to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you guys. I'm really looking forward to this.
Well, thanks. I'm going to introduce our other co-author, our other co-founder of the organization of the Atheist and Christian Book Club, Bill Cluck. Bill, tell us a little bit about yourself, and I'm going to let you lead off the questions to John here.
Can I give my testimony first?
Yeah, go ahead.
John, I was atheist for 6 years, and because of Daniel Ray and Watchman Fellowship, they've kind of convinced me to be a theist. So anyway,
you're not a Christian at this point, though, right?
No, it's a big enough step to be a theist, much less. So I'm getting all this flack from atheists. I can't win, you know. So.
Well, John, when Bill made that announcement towards the end of last year, we've been talking about it for a long time privately, but when he made the announcement for the book club, I called up some of his favorite authors over the years and asked them to be here and give him a best case. So John Loftus and we went down the list of a lot of his favorite, Dale Allison, some of his favorite authors. And so you feel free to try to help him out of his theism at this point, because he is open-minded. That's what I like about
James'
Bill.
credit, he tried to be very fair by bringing both sides in to see, but I just felt the evidence was overwhelming, especially the biggest thing was the fine tuning and so forth from Luke Barnes, The Fortunate Universe, pretty much put me over the edge. But anyway, we're talking about Jesus, which I feel much more comfortable with than fine tuning.
We're not going to be talking about any cosmological issues tonight, I don't think.
Yeah,
we'll get into that. That stuff is pretty complicated. So,
oh my gosh, we're all treading water there, aren't we?
Yeah, we are.
But,
we are.
But Jesus, we can well, let's talk about Jesus. Let's talk about the prophecies. Let's talk about Psalm 22, where it speaks about Jesus on the cross. It speaks about him dividing his garments. It speaks about it's almost like you're at the foot of the cross looking to Jesus. Isn't this kind of and he obviously had no control over how they would, spend money for their, garments or whatever and so forth. That was amazing prediction, which he had no control over, much less his dying on a cross. You would think he would have been stoned. So, isn't it an amazing prediction?
Well, I mean, to say amazing, again, if you have to sort of look to the Jews and the way that they interpret these things. So, I mean, I think that a lot of these, depending on how you interpret them, and if you interpret them in hindsight, then they can certainly look like Jesus, right? I mean, and I think that's what the early Christians were doing, is they were going back and they were trying to find text in the Bible that sounded like Jesus. And when you're going back and doing that, it's just it's like data mining, really. When you have a certain conclusion in mind, it's easier to go back and you have this entire rich text of that's not necessarily literal in every sense. There's a lot of poetry in the Bible, in the Old Testament, in the Tanakh, and so to look to that document and to go through it and to find things where people are using very figurative and imaginative imagery, then yes, you can pull things out, somewhat out of context at times, and say that this was referring to Jesus. But I think you have to look to the Jews themselves who wrote this, and these were their documents. This was their scripture. And I think that a lot of times when you see Christian apologists talk about these, they don't really give enough credit to the Jews and the way that they've interpreted these for thousands of years, because a lot of these interpretations came later in the day, and again by people that were not disinterested in the subject matter. I mean, these were people that had an incentive to try to proselytize their faith. So when they were looking for these documents, where they were looking for these proof texts, they were trying to demonstrate that they were about Jesus. So I think that you have to look at it, I think, that way, and not necessarily immediately jump to the conclusion that this has to be about Jesus just because it sounds like Jesus.
Well, that's what my professor at UNC said, the exact same thing you did, that they're retrofitting. And some things Jesus could have controlled, like me and Dr. Blevins had a little discussion on the Zechariah prophecy that says, you'll come into Jerusalem on a colt, the ass of a colt or whatever, the donkey. So there, it makes Jesus look like he's riding on a circus animal or whatever, that Matthew did not understand parallelism where you're just repeating the same thing in a different thing. Exactly. So obviously he goes, oh, Peter, I forgot that donkey thing. Grab me a donkey so I can fulfill this prophecy. But obviously in Isaiah 9, it says that he would be buried in a rich man's tomb. Now, he didn't have any control over that.
It doesn't say he'll be buried in a rich man's tomb. That's not what it says.
What does it say?
I'll have to. I can't quote it.
For that?
Exactly. Let me see if I can find it. I have it in here somewhere.
I had it before, but Joseph, by the way, Joseph of Arimathea, which was a rich man, which is kind of counterintuitive that someone from the Sanhedrin that voted for his death would provide a tomb. I think it says he would be buried with the rich or something, correct?
Yeah, I'm just trying to find it.
I have the exact verse.
Yeah, see if you can find the exact verse.
But you see my point, typical lawyer, he wants to have exactly the exact.
It's Isaiah 53:9.
I thought
yeah, Isaiah 53.
It's 53. It's part of the 53 prophecy.
Yeah.
Okay, that's where I was getting the 9.
Yeah, 9 was correct.
You want to read it for us?
Yeah, read it,
Daniel.
Okay, sure, absolutely. Isaiah 9, 53:9, just 9, not the whole thing, but his grave. This is the New American Standard. His grave was assigned with wicked men, Yet he was with a rich man in his death, because he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit.
Right. So, yeah. So, I mean, you're saying in his death, what does that even mean? It doesn't mean it doesn't say he was buried. And again, we're talking about reading ambiguous language and someone saying, well, that means like in his death means where he was buried with rich men. So, again, that's, and there are, again, several people that say that the whole Joseph of Arimathea, the entire story of Joseph of Arimathea may have been built around this, may have been crafted by Mark because of these passages, which again, I think that one itself is a great example of ambiguity. It doesn't say exactly what people argue that it says, which is again that he was actually buried in a rich man's tomb. That's not what it says.
Also,
But you could interpret it that way.
I can't help but notice that it says, and they made his grave with the wicked as the first part of this. And so if you're going to claim that he fulfilled the rich man part, then, but he didn't fulfill the wicked part, like he was buried ostensibly in a new grave, and he was the first and only one to be buried in that grave. But this prophecy is saying he was buried with the wicked. So
yeah, it's really the opposite. Yeah, and I think I actually said
it both ways. You can't say
the grave,
the rich part, not the wicked part.
Right. It seems to me that would be the more plausible way to read it, is the grave would be where he's actually buried. That's what we think of as a grave, that his grave was with the wicked, and yet it's being read by people saying, well, no, the grave part should be applied to the rich.
Yeah, he died. I understand this passage, and I could be wrong. I understand this passage to mean that he died a wicked man's death, like the two criminals on the cross who were crucified on both sides of Jesus. One eventually, they're both, castigating him, and one eventually comes around. But I think he died like a wicked person.
And they made his grave with the wicked, according to translation.
Yeah. And I think
I'm not saying you're wrong. I mean, I'm just saying that I think that there's ambiguity here, and that it can be read. I mean, the grave of the wicked doesn't necessarily mean he died a wicked man. Could it mean that? Sure.
Well, his body in a grave, just like everybody else. I think that's kind of what it. Now, I could be wrong. John, a quick question about this, because I was reading this and I picked up on it early on as I was looking at. I was specifically interested in the Isaiah 53 part that you talked about.
Yeah.
And I'm, kudos to you. I was really impressed with how you really were tagging on scripture there and letting scripture interpret scripture. And there weren't block quotes of liberal scholars. You were just kind of going with the Bible. So that was a good, made me dig a lot. You had mentioned this is a Jewish book in the Old Testament, which I think we can all agree on that. And there's obviously a difference in interpretation about the Messiah between Jews and Christians. That's been the case ever since the advent of Christianity. Is there a way, John, I don't want to put words in your mouth or assume, but are you assuming that the Old Testament, the Jewish interpretation of the Old Testament, is the correct interpretation of the Old Testament, that the Jews got it right?
I'm not assuming anything, because I think that none of us can say what the correct interpretation is, but I'm saying you can't discount the Jewish interpretation.
No. I just wanted to be clear. I'm not saying that. I was just kind of like wondering in the back of my mind if you thought the Jewish interpretation was the one that we ought to be looking at rather than the Christian one per se.
I would say I find it more plausible because I think it makes more sense of the entire context of Isaiah 53. I think the Jewish interpretation makes more sense to me. I'm not saying, I didn't walk in with a predisposition to say, because the Jews wrote this, their interpretation must be right. I'm trying to look at all the interpretations and see what makes the most sense to me, and what makes sense of the entire, all of Isaiah and all of Isaiah 53 and all the servant songs together. When you read them together, and what comes before Isaiah 53 and what comes after Isaiah 53. But no, I wouldn't say that just because these are Jewish scholars and, it was a book written by Jews, that necessarily settles the question. It does not settle the question, I think.
John, let's get to more specifics. It says in Micah 5:2, he would be born in Bethlehem. That's pretty specific. He would be born.
Well, it doesn't. It says, well, as it's interpreted, the tribe of Bethlehem, of tribe of Bethlehem, which is the tribe of David. It doesn't say born in Bethlehem. And numerous scholars have looked at this and say that what that means is that he will be of the tribe of David, of the tribe. So it's not necessarily a prediction that he will be born in Bethlehem.
Okay. How about the 30? I remember the great John Shelby Spong. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but now he's kind of, nobody knows who he is now, but he was speaking over here at TCU. And I said, how about that 30 pieces of silver? Could you get any more specific? The potter's field, as predicted in Zechariah. He goes, I don't know. That probably was made up. So is this just radical skepticism on your part?
Well, again, I don't think so. I think that, again, you try to look at all the different interpretations and possibilities. And we're looking, you have to back up and say, what are we trying to do here, right? We're looking at ancient literature and we're trying to interpret it. And we have, on one hand, a group of people that interpreted it for many years, with one set of presuppositions. And then you have another group that came in later and they had their own beliefs. And so, and you don't know when you get to the Gospels what information they had when they wrote these and where that information came from. You don't know if Robin Faith Walsh has come out, has a book where she talks about, her view is that Mark had to have been written by people that were educated, and that it couldn't have been people that knew Jesus, because they wouldn't have had the education necessary to write the way the Gospels are written. And that means that these were people, wealthy people from outside the area of Palestine. And they had lots of stories to draw from. They also had the Jewish scriptures to draw from. So we don't know to what extent the Gospels were written with the scriptures in mind to actually plug in prophecies from the scriptures, from the Tanakh, and what was actually, done, the history part of it. So it's just, we don't know that. And so we're having to, to say, well, there's something that's specific in there and it says it in the Gospels. And then we go back to a prophecy. And a lot of these aren't even prophecies. They're just statements in the Tanakh that were never considered to be prophecies. And later someone went back and said, oh, well, look at that. It fits into this story. So again, you can say that seems to be very, very coincidental, but we don't know whether someone actually wrote the Gospels to correspond to the scripture, or whether the gospel was written and it just happens to correspond to something that happened in history. We don't know that.
But wouldn't you say, like, let's take Mark 6, where it says, look, Jesus couldn't do any big miracles. And, the family's trying to get him out of here. You look at the Syrophoenician woman that Jesus is kind of a jerk. He says, she goes, hey, could you heal me? And he goes, look, why should I give the bread to the crumbs? And she goes, or the children's bread to the foreigners. He was kind of, anus, xenophobic.
I think his word was dogs, Bill.
Yeah, to the dogs.
Even worse. But doesn't that show a kind of an aura of verisimilitude to that these writers are trying to be honest and transparent about Jesus, not making him look all that great like the Syrophoenician woman?
Well, you could say that, or you could say that they were there was a message that what Jesus was bringing in the kingdom of God was for the Jews. It was not for people that were outside the Jewish faith. You could say that was what that story was trying to say. Or, in your view, it made him look like a jerk, and that made him more human, right?
Right.
So again, I'm not saying that is necessarily, or any of these are the wrong interpretation. I'm saying these are interpretations that make more sense to me. And I think in that sense, what makes more sense is that the message that Jesus had in Mark, especially, was that the kingdom of God is coming, and that it's coming to the Jews, and it's not for people that are not Jewish. And you Jews need to get right with God. You need to follow this. You need to follow the Tanakh. You need to follow the laws of God, and you need to be good to other people. I think that was perhaps the greatest thing that Jesus brought. I think that Jesus I mean, when I wrote this book, I'm not anti-Jesus. I mean, I think Jesus was one of our greatest.
So
Um,
you are a historicist, right? You believe in Jesus was historical.
Absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. I mean, I hope that was clear from the book. I absolutely believe that Jesus was a historical figure.
I wasn't sure if just for the sake of argument, you were just going to assume rather than fight that
No,
battle
no,
and
no.
deal with it that way.
No, I absolutely believed that Jesus was a historical figure.
But you see my point, John, that these are real life characters. You get Peter denying Jesus. The disciples all clear out. They've checked out. It's not like Mormonism where there's black and white cardboard characters. This is real. Does that make sense?
It does, but again, look at it this way. I mean, Mark had a story to tell. Each of these gospel writers had a message, had a story to tell. And I think what Mark's story was that Jesus came and he was the Messiah. That is Mark's view, and that the Jews before Jesus had a view that the Messiah was going to be this great leader, and there was no way that the Messiah was going to die a dishonorable death. And what Mark was saying was that no, that was the message all along. That is who Jesus, that was who the Messiah was going to be. And but the problem was that no one, even in Jesus's day, could see it, because the Jews of Jesus's day did not see it that way. They had a very difficult time converting Jews. That's why Paul's messages were much more, or his overall message was much more acceptable to and much more successful with the Gentiles. And so I think what Mark was saying is that even among Jesus's own followers, they didn't get it either. These people did not understand who he was and what he was going to do. And when he told them, for instance, that he was going to die, and so this goes back to, like the suffering servant and Isaiah 53, and this whole idea that this referred to Jesus. Well, Jesus preached from Isaiah. He preached from the Tanakh completely. I mean, that was what he did. He was a rabbi, and the idea that this was something that everybody understood, that the suffering servant passages referred to the Messiah and that he was going to die. That clearly Jesus's followers did not understand that, because when he told them that, he called Peter Satan. He said that's I mean he's like, that's crazy. That his followers did not understand that. And that was the message of Mark. And so these stories about Peter denying him, that fits into that perfectly, right? Because these were things, and you could say, again, you could argue that showed Peter's humanity, that it humanizes him and makes it more realistic. But you could also say that it fits into a really common theme, a theme that's common throughout Mark, that he was having to do, because people did not believe this. It was crazy to them that this person, Jesus, was the Messiah, because he died this horrible death. So this story was a persuasive one. It was a polemical one. And it was trying to tell that story.
Would you go so far as the women who are very marginalized, and to invent that women would discover the tomb? That makes no sense.
It does make sense, because women were the ones who went to clean the bodies of the dead. It wouldn't have made any sense for men to be there. It's just the same reason that you have maids find dead bodies in hotel rooms, because they're the people that go to the hotel rooms. So absolutely, it would make sense. It's the only thing that would make sense. And the male disciples had left. They had fled. So It didn't make any sense for them to have been there. It only makes sense for the women to have gone to be there. And the fact that women were not considered to be unreliable in all respects. They were considered to be unreliable in court, in aspects that of things like property ownership that came up in court as witnesses. That did not mean that women were considered unreliable in matters of the home or in matters that were within their particular areas of expertise. And cleaning and washing the bodies and anointing the bodies were exactly what women did. So I think it makes perfect sense and is much more believable if someone were inventing this particular detail. And again, I'm not saying specifically that they are, but I think that it makes more sense for them to have the women discover that Jesus was gone than to somehow find some contrived way to get men there, because there would have been no reason for men to be there.
Well, let me just get to the bottom line here. Your leader, you believe in Q, right? Which has filled with apocalypticism, right? Q, you believe in Q, right?
Yeah, he
Yes.
talks about it in the book about
Okay.
Q, the Q document, John.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have these people, these disciples believing that he's going to bring in, usher in this new kingdom where everything's going to flip. The poor will be rich, the rich will be poor. Everything's going to change. He's going to bring the kingdom of God onto earth. And what happens? He dies an ignominious death, totally different than what they expected. They remember the Sons of Thunder, whatever. Hey, who's going to sit on your right and left? Who's going to be, the big guy in this new kingdom? And uh, everything just goes wrong. He's crucified. And you admit the disciples, they checked out. So my question is, how in the world do you go from this total, defeat to the world's largest religion?
Well, I talk about that in the book, but I'll go back through it. So I mean, my view is that when that happened, it was a catastrophic moment for the movement. And we know what happens from many, many studies. There's a book, When Prophecy Fails, where these investigators and scientists, went back and looked at many, many examples of when you had a cultic move. James, I'm sure you are very familiar with this.
I've read the book and quoted from it numerous times.
Right, of cults. And what happens is, and it happens again and again, is that when you have specific prophecies, they are reinterpreted after that. They go from a literal sense to a more spiritual sense that are basically unfalsifiable. And it's not that people just give up and they say, oh, well, didn't pan out, didn't work out, we're just going to all go back to our day jobs. That's not what happens. They find a way because there's a certain commitment, there's a psychological commitment in these groups. A lot of people give up everything. And I think in the Jesus movement, he was asking people to give up everything. So it makes perfect sense that in this particular community, you would have had that exact dynamic in play. And so when that happened, you have people that are looking for another way to look at the situation, to reinterpret the situation so that they're not wrong, so that they're correct, so that they're right. And so there are, and I talk about this as well when I get to the third chapter, which is the hallucination hypothesis, which is that grief hallucination, bereavement hallucinations are extremely common. And many, many people, most people actually, are likely to have feelings when someone dies, someone close to them. They see them or they hear them in some sense. And many people believe that to be real, very real. And sometimes it happens with multiple people. And I think it only takes one or two people in this community to have had those types of experiences. And this is at a time when we didn't understand how hallucinations worked. And there was a widespread belief in the supernatural. And you had not only that, but you had an expectation, because within the Tanakh, you have these prophecies of the end times when there will be a resurrection of the dead. And Jesus talked about that. And he talked about the coming kingdom. And one of the things that would happen at the kingdom is that you would have a resurrection of the dead. So the fact that he had talked about this, there was an expectation that would happen. So that makes it more likely that people would experience these exact types of hallucinations. So if James and Peter, for instance, had such hallucinations and told other people about it, they were the leaders of this community. And then other people would believe them. And that type of thing can spread. It only takes a few. And once they believed that he had risen, that he had been resurrected. And then in Matthew, you actually have a story of other resurrections happening. And when Paul talks about this, when he talks about Jesus being resurrected, he talks about it as the first fruits, because to Paul and to Matthew as well, Jesus's resurrection was not a one and done. It was not a singular event. It was the beginning of the mass resurrection of the dead that would accompany the coming of the new kingdom. So they thought that this was what was happening. So when that happened, you had multiple people that they then went back and they figured out, well, how is it that Jesus would be resurrected? And it only made sense if he actually were the Messiah. So then they could say, well, these prophecies of him being the Messiah and him saying the Messiah, it was correct. We just didn't understand how it worked. But now we do. Now we understand that he had to die. And when Mark wrote his gospel, he explained this in more detail. That was, in my view, the reason that Mark wrote his gospel, is to make this clear to everyone and explain how this all works. And then when Matthew came along, he added, because he was trying to preach to a Jewish community, so he added a number of proof texts to this to demonstrate more conclusively to Jews that Jesus was indeed the Messiah. So, I mean, it spreads from that, because the other thing about Christianity, unlike other faiths, is that it was a missionary faith. It was a proselytizing faith. And they were going, Paul especially was going to the Gentiles, and he was very effective. The Jesus movement in Jerusalem was not nearly as effective as Paul, because they were not, just as the Jews, they're not proselytizing.
That's one of my biggest questions is if it wasn't, Paul has been called the co-founder of Christianity, co-inventor, whatever. So you have this small Jewish sect of Peter and James, the Jerusalem Council and Church. And then you have Paul going, look, you don't have to be circumcised. You can eat a pork sandwich or shrimp, whatever, you're good to go. Would we be the largest religious domination? Would Christianity be where it is today if it wasn't for Paul?
I don't think so. I think Paul was absolutely integral to the growth of Christianity, because Paul took a Jewish religion, because I mean, Jesus was thoroughly Jewish, and he took it to the Gentiles. And there weren't, even among the Gentiles, there was no religion, when you talk about the pagan religions, that was missionary in the sense that Christianity was. That was, where they were going around and trying to get other people to be part of the faith. And so that was new. That was a new aspect. And Paul was extremely good at being a salesman for this faith. He was clearly a great writer. He was a good speaker. He was very, he kept correspondence up with all of these churches, all of these congregations. So he was absolutely a people person. I mean, Paul was the one. He was the key factor in spreading Christianity to the world, because it never would have spread outside of Judaism. And the fact was that pagans, they lived a hard life, right? And their gods did not care about them. Their gods, they would just have to sacrifice things to their gods. And this was a God that cared about them and that had a promise for them of something in the future, of everlasting life. That is quite a sale. I mean, that is a great pitch, right? And it was new. So it was something that no one had ever done before. So you had someone with an interest in selling this and a great product to sell. So it's not surprising to me that Paul was effective. I think Paul was a unique individual and uniquely good at his job. But there's no doubt that Christianity would never have taken off to the extent that it did without Paul.
So John, what you're saying is your theory would be probably the resurrection could be explained by a very limited shared hallucination, grief hallucination, with probably Jesus's brother James, as well as Peter, and maybe a couple of others. Then as that got shared, the gospel writers come back and try to put that in the mouth of Jesus. Or did you think Jesus also had that theory even before he died?
I don't think Jesus had that theory before he died. I don't
So
think
all of that's just invented dialogue and stuff by the gospel writers to try to justify the grief hallucinations.
What specifically are you saying is
But when Jesus tells the disciples that it's imperative that I die, and it's a seed falls to the ground and dies and brings forth fruit, and I would have to go to Jerusalem, be crucified and be raised again. And Peter says that cannot be, and get me behind. All this is just invented dialogue to kind of justify these grief hallucinations.
3 days in
I
the
don't,
belly of
I,
the whale.
I'm sorry, what?
3 days in the belly of the whale. That was a prophecy as well. Like he likened himself to Jonah in the belly of the whale and then coming out afterwards.
Right. Yeah, I don't think he actually predicted his death. I think that came afterwards. I think that Jesus, as he definitely believed that he was the Messiah, but I think he believed that he was going to that he was going to be the traditional Messiah, that he was going to satisfy all of the prophecies of the Old Testament of the Messiah. I don't think he actually believed that he was going to die. I think that that did come afterwards.
Well, I want to agree with you on something. First of all, the prophecies, all prophecies, whether they're true or false, it's clarified after the fact, not before the fact. No one that I can find was looking for two comings before Jesus.
Right.
So it's easy to go back now and make a case for, well, the suffering servant, that's talking about the first coming and the triumphant, conquering Jesus. Well, that's talking about the second coming, but it's not in the Bible, coming one, coming two. That is interpretation after the fact. And I think all prophecy works that way. It's whether it's a true or false prophecy, it's clarified after the fact, not before. So you're right about the Jews are still not looking for two comings. They're still looking for just one coming if they believe that there is a coming Messiah in the future at some time. So I want to agree with you on that. And I did have the reference, if you want to comment on, you already kind of dealt with it, but the actual reference to Bethlehem in Micah chapter 5, verse 2, but you, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come from me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origin are from old, from ancient of times. And then New Testament, you have when the story of the Magi, they were asked, where would Jesus be born? Where the prophecy, and then they say it should be Bethlehem, the suburb of Jerusalem.
Well, there's no doubt that Matthew interpreted the Micah prophecy as being Bethlehem, and as did Luke. And there were many people that did, but I'm saying people today, when they say the clan, it says, as you read it, it's the clan of Bethlehem. That was, as it's interpreted in the Hebrew, that was the clan of David. That's what that meant.
One of the cities of David. You're right about that. The Bethlehem.
It didn't say the city of Bethlehem.
Jerusalem proper.
Yeah, it said the clan, and so that's
where their lands were divided among Joseph's children, and then into the promised land when Joshua comes in. The clans territorially, if the clan is from Bethlehem, that's the same thing as saying geographically that's where they're from as well. So the
not necessarily. How so? The clan initiated, it began in Bethlehem. That is the city of David, right? Mm-hmm. And so when you say that, you're saying the clan of David, basically the seed of David. So it's another way of saying, and again, we're talking about, there were different ways that people used, different terms they use, different figures that they use. And that was one of them to describe the seed of David, was the clan of Bethlehem. So again, there's not only one way to interpret that. And many have interpreted it as,
well, I'm thinking, yeah, but for 3,000 years, back in 1995, I think it was, Israel celebrated 3,000 years of King David in the city of Jerusalem. That locale has never changed in 3 millennia. And so the idea that Bethlehem wasn't also a territory that would have been well known by the Jews, especially if Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience, which I think he is, they would have been able to check geographically if Matthew had got his map wrong in terms of Bethlehem. I mean, it's unequivocal. I don't know that there would be another place.
I'm not saying that there was another place. I'm not saying that he got his map wrong. I'm just saying that there are different ways to interpret the Micah prophecy. And again, I'm saying the writer of Matthew and the writer of Luke, and I'm sure others at the time, did interpret it as that the Messiah had to come from Bethlehem. There's no doubt about that.
Some of our other atheist authors have speculated that the whole Bethlehem portion was backdated and added into the story later, that Jesus was actually born somewhere in Galilee.
Yeah.
And then, so
No,
what
no,
about this prophecy we left out? Well, let's write this in and come back and fix the story at some
right.
later
Well,
date.
yeah, I believe that. I think, I mean, and to my point, it doesn't really matter. I mean, I can grant that the Micah prophecy said that it was Bethlehem, that he was going to be born in Bethlehem, because I think my main point is that Luke and Matthew both believe that. And when you look at Matthew and Luke's nativity stories, they're different in every way. I mean, they're completely different. You could say you could harmonize them, but only by weaving them together, because they don't really overlap on much of anything. So, but they both get Jesus to Bethlehem for his birth, but in completely different ways and by completely different timelines. So it doesn't really, I mean, so when you look at where Matthew and Luke depart from Mark, it's before Jesus's baptism and after his death, because Mark, of course, has no post-resurrection appearances. And in both of those, and those two areas, they're just completely different. And again, I'm not saying that they in every way contradict each other, but they're just not the same stories. I mean, in Matthew, you have I mean, it just follows the story of Moses. He's basically the new Moses going down to Egypt and coming back and all of it. And Pharaoh, you know, I mean, basically you've got, you know, this edict that goes out from Herod to kill the babies, just like Pharaoh did, all of that. And he's born essentially as a king. You know, you have the Magi, you have the Zoroastrian Magi that appear. I mean, his is the birth of a king. And in Luke, it's very different. I mean, he's born in a manger. He's basically, it's a very common man type of story. There are no Magi there. It's just, you know, I mean, they're just farm animals basically. So these are just two very different stories.
Well, do you think, John, in the nativity, the stable birth and the wise men visit are about 2 years apart? You know that, right?
Right.
Okay. So they would be different because it's two different time periods in that capacity. The nativity.
What do you mean the nativity? I'm just
Well,
saying.
so the wise men come to the house where Jesus is, and he's about 2 years old at that time, given the Herod's what Herod determines from the wise men. They're about, Matthew's entering the story at about, Jesus is about 2. Luke has him born. The annunciation of the angels is his birth, physical birth. He's born in the stable, but eventually, by the time of the wise men's arrival, he's in a house and he's a toddler.
They're already gone by then, because they go directly after his presentation to the temple. In Luke, they go right up to Nazareth.
Yeah.
They don't last 2 years. It's a contradiction, really. They don't last 2 years.
How is that a contradiction, Ken?
You have to bring up the actual text and we can look at it.
Well, I don't want to get into like line by line. My point though is that the stories have very different themes. They come at it from very different angles. They tell very different. They have very different approaches to who Jesus was when they're talking about his nativity. And I think Matthew is more focused on him being the new Moses and on him being the Jewish Messiah. And Luke is more focused on, I mean, when you look at the genealogy, it just goes back to Abraham, because with Matthew, because he's just focused on him being the Messiah in the line of David and Jewish. Whereas with Luke, he's talking about, it's more of a Gentile focused gospel. And he goes all the way back to Adam, because for him, Jesus is for everyone. And so, although in every other way, the genealogy is different on basically every single name. And again, this is why they're contradictory in numerous ways. But Luke is focused on a different view of Jesus, a savior to humanity, to Gentiles as well as Jews. And that is why I think his gospel takes this different approach and a more humanizing approach to Jesus and a more universalist approach to who Jesus was, even from his birth.
Do you think we have enough information, John, about the genealogies and the families and the people that are mentioned to say that they're contrary? I mean, I could list all my mother's family and my father's family and completely separate, but they wouldn't be contradictory because my mom's family names are going to be different than my father's side. Do we have enough information, do you think, in the genealogies to be able to say they're contrary?
Well, I do, because I think every name, none of the names are the same. And you would expect there to be at least a few of the same names. And the names would always run through, I think the father, I'm trying to remember. And so when you list all the names, they would all be of the male, of the father. So, I mean, how could they all be, and how could they not, how could they all be different and yet be the same genealogy? And the other thing is, what difference does it make if these are the genealogies of Joseph? Because Joseph wasn't the father, but they had to run through him for him to be a descendant of David, for him to qualify as the Messiah.
Well, under Jewish law, um, Joseph legally married to Mary would be the father, in a spiritual sense, that even though there was no physical procreation like Mormons assess that the Holy Ghost, God impregnated Mary, it doesn't have to be a physical intercourse for there to be a legitimate genealogy in the eyes of Jewish lineage. It
But
is a,
well, but for the Messiahship, you're talking about, you say that the genealogy would go back through Joseph just because he was the adopted father, that there was no blood relationship between Jesus and David, because the Jews have always believed that the Messiah will be the actual descendant by blood to David all the way back. So that would be, I think, a very novel approach, that he wouldn't have to be, that there would be no blood association with David, that he could just be related to David by marriage.
well, I mean, scriptures are clear about, I mean, in Luke 24:27, when Jesus is walking along the road to Emmaus, Luke tells us that beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he spoke of them. He spoke of all the scriptures concerning himself and all the scriptures. So the idea that Jesus needed to have a father that actually physically procreated with Mary is not necessarily essential for him to be the fulfilled Messiah through the line of David, and finally Joseph is his father. Jewish ancestry would allow for this, but I would agree that this was something of an anomaly to Jews. But it's not finally going to disqualify Jesus from becoming the line that he is. You mentioned 2 Samuel in the book about the unbroken line that God promises to David, and then mention the end, the physical human end of David's kingdom, and say that, well, there's a period of space here where there's nobody sitting on David's throne, but in 2 Samuel 7, God is establishing David's throne forever. So it's not that there needs to be a human on the throne until the time of Jesus, but that because Jesus is from all eternity, if you read the rest of Micah 5:2, it says that the one born in Bethlehem will be from all of eternity, from the ancient of time. So the fulfillment of David's lineage comes full circle in Jesus, but he has always been the Messiah, that the promised Messiah since Genesis, and a lot of Jews who had accepted Christ understand that lineage and that promise in the garden of God having somebody on David's throne that comes about in fulfillment in earth time through the Messiah and through the lineage that eventually comes through Christ. But as you know,
this strikes me just like we talked about with when prophecies fail, it's spiritualized, just like the Jehovah's Witnesses spiritualize Jesus' return.
Well, why does that make it wrong, Ken? I don't understand why that would make it wrong.
Because it's historically there was a broken line, and so you fill it in with a.
I'm not filling it in. It's what the scriptures are saying. I mean, it's not just because it's spiritual doesn't mean it's false. That's the problem. I think the thing that you have to justify is, why is it because it's spiritual it's false?
Well, just because the scriptures say it doesn't mean it's true either, right? I mean,
you just said it strikes you, and I don't think that's a legitimate epistemological reason for why it would be false. That something just because it's spiritual would be false.
Well, it's a convenient way of dodging the issue.
Well, it's a convenient way of dismissing the issue too.
Well, I'm not saying that it's false, and again, and I'm not saying that you're necessarily wrong, but I think that, I've talked to many Jews about this, and their view is that the line of David through the Messiah is a blood lineage, and that's the way it was always understood. And so they don't understand how, if Jesus did not have a human father in Joseph, that and you have genealogies that are not the same, that there is any tie to David through those genealogies. So, I mean, I guess that's the That's the issue I have with that. But again, it's part of a broader issue of the difference between Luke and Matthew's approach to Jesus's nativity, which is again two different stories. I mean, you have to admit that the stories really don't have anything in common. You could harmonize them by saying, well, they both could have happened at different time periods, but the stories themselves are just very different, as are the stories of the post-resurrection appearances.
Can we get to, I wanted to get to something in Isaiah 53, if that's not switching topics, if anybody else has another question.
Let me say this on that. If you do have a question, if you'll put it in the text, or if you just want to make a comment, and then Daniel will monitor that and then ask you to unmute and ask your question. So it doesn't just need to be 3 or 4 of us. If you have a question, you don't have to, but if you want to come on, or even if you want us to ask the question for you, if you
put
want
it in the text, or I could
text,
exit,
and we'll take care of that.
We'll ask it for you. Ken, did you want to follow up? I didn't mean to cut you off. You want to finish up there?
I don't feel like, I mean, we could probably have a conversation offline later about some of this stuff, but I don't want to get contentious about it.
No problem. Isaiah 53, I know, John, you said that this wasn't, you're very clear about this not being a messianic prophecy, correct?
I don't think it's a messianic prophecy.
And your reason for that is that you believe that the servant mentioned in Isaiah 53 is Israel. Is that correct?
Israel, so it goes back and forth. It's the book, well, this part of Isaiah, which is written by second Isaiah, goes back and forth in its discussion of the servant between Israel and the righteous remnant of Israel. It's not entirely consistent on that. So sometimes it's Israel as a nation, and at other times it's just the righteous people within Israel, because it recognizes that there are people within Israel that are not necessarily righteous. And so it seems to be sort of two slightly different minds on that, because it does, at different passages, discuss both.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you about, I could have missed it in the book, and I'm sorry if I did. Verses 1 through 6 are talking about us and our. A lot of the pronouns in there are very specific about us and our. And then in verse 7, it shifts to a he. So there's a shift there. And then the thing I really wanted to emphasize here was verse 10. It says, "But the Lord was pleased to crush him, to put him to grief, if he would render himself as a guilt offering." And I know that a guilt offering, it's mentioned in Leviticus 5:18, Leviticus 7:2, Leviticus 6:6, where a guilt offering has to be without blemish. So the idea that the servant in 53 is Israel is not possible, given the reference to a guilt offering. Whoever the servant is has to be without blemish.
But the righteous remnant of Israel was essentially defined in that way. They were the ones that were without blemish. They were the ones that were without sin. They were
Where is that specifically, where the Israel is without blemish? Where did you see that?
I didn't say Israel was without blemish.
No, you're saying that it was understood that way.
The righteous remnant of Israel, when their discussions about this particular part of Israel, the way it is defined is in such a way that these are the people that are not, these are the righteous of the nation of Israel.
But the verse 10
does make sense in that way.
The verse 10 is singular to a he, not a we.
Because the servant this is a metaphor for both.
Are you sure? How do we know that's a metaphor?
I'm not sure of anything. I'm telling you, as I hope I made clear, I'm not certain of any of this. This is my interpretation. This is my approach. It's what makes sense to me, and these are my arguments as to why, and I've laid them out as to why I believe this. I'm not saying I'm certain of it. I'm not saying that you're necessarily wrong. I think on many of these things, otherwise atheists and Christians and different sects of Christianity wouldn't have been arguing over these things for hundreds, if not thousands of years. I think that there are different ways to interpret this. I'm just trying to give you my view of it. And I think that when you look at all of the passages in the servant songs, in which Jews have been, I mean, Israel is, and the righteous remnant of Israel are identified numerous times within the servant songs as the servant. I mean, multiple times. And before Isaiah 53 and after Isaiah 53, everyone agrees that the references to the servant are to Israel and the righteous remnant of Israel.
Mhm.
Everyone agrees to that. So, I mean, the argument to me has to be from those who say it's Jesus, that in this one passage, somehow it shifts to the Messiah, and then it shifts immediately back.
Mhm.
And I've
Mhm.
gone through and I've laid out, I think, I've tried to be very specific about passage by passage why I think these consistently continue to refer to Israel and the righteous remnant of Israel, and why in each case they don't apply to Jesus. And when you say without blemish, Jesus was not without blemish either, in certainly a physical sense. He had been uh, beaten up. He had been whipped. He was bloody. He had been a crown of thorn had been placed on him. So when you talk about a sacrifice, like the lamb sacrifice, that means that nothing could have been done to it beforehand. It had to be without any physical blemish. Jesus did not qualify in that way. It is very explicit when it talks about the passion narrative that he did not qualify, that he was the furthest thing from without blemish. So if you're going to try to apply it to Jesus, I think you have to deal with that because it doesn't apply to Jesus.
Well,
So
I think the blemish here is translating from animal sacrifice to moral sacrifice. That Jesus, as verse 6 says in 53, but the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him. The blemish free, the guilt free, but where Jesus does qualify was that he walked in perfect righteousness in his active obedience. He fulfilled every jot and tittle of the law. And so in that capacity, not in a physical sense, but in the capacity of a spiritual and moral sense of being perfectly righteous before the law of God, fulfilling it by walking in it. That is what it means, at least from the perspective of Jesus being a sacrifice for our sins, not that he was bruised and cut. So I think the problem too with Isaiah 53 being Israel is that Israel has the iniquity that needs to be borne by someone else. And so the guilt offering is not an animal in this case. It's looking forward to Jesus as the perfect moral sacrifice. That's the way I see it as a Christian.
yeah, and I understand that. And again, I'm not saying you're necessarily wrong, but I think this is part of the problem of analogizing this to an animal sacrifice, because in an animal sacrifice, the blemishes were physical blemishes. So it's kind of hard to say, where does the analogy break down? And again, I think that when you talk about Israel versus the righteous remnant of Israel, the righteous remnant of Israel was righteous. They didn't have the same issues, the same moral blemishes. They were considered righteous. So it does apply to them. And I don't think that there's a problem, but I understand your point.
Okay.
Again, I'm not saying that you're wrong about it. I think there are different ways to look at it. That's just the way I look at it.
Sure. Well, thank you for responding.
I
Absolutely.
remember when I was a believer that, I read Isaiah 53. For me, that was one of the more powerful indicators that Christianity was true. And then I wondered, well, how did the Jews interpret that? And I found out that they interpreted the singular he, the servant, as the collective of the nation of Israel, or the remnant of Israel. And I poo-pooed it because it's like, oh, they're just making that up because they want to get out from under the weight of the fact that this is a true prophecy. Then I actually read the surrounding chapters in context and realized, oh, there's many places where the servant is referring to the remnant of Israel as a collective, to my son Jacob. Jacob is my servant. So it's not far-fetched. It's not trying to get out from under the weight of a prophecy to try to contradict the Christian interpretation. It's the natural interpretation that was prevalent before the time of Christ. Now, I will say, to steelman the Christian position, that I know Bart Ehrman, and I think you also, John, have asserted that before the time of Jesus, there were no Jewish interpreters who interpreted Isaiah 53 as anything other as messianic.
I did not say that. I did not
Okay,
say
I'm
that.
sorry.
And in
I'm sorry if
fact,
I misrepresented that.
no, I know that there were some, but they were
Okay,
just in the
right,
minority. But there
right,
were.
okay.
There absolutely.
Okay, yeah, I just want to make it clear that I acknowledge, and I think we all should acknowledge. I think Bart Ehrman sometimes, at least the way I read him, seems to indicate that nobody was thinking of Jesus as being of the servant in Isaiah 53 as being messianic or
No,
stuff.
I'm not saying that.
Okay.
And again, I'm not saying that that's a crazy interpretation
Yeah,
at all.
right.
And I'm not saying that there haven't been people that even among Jews that have said that that's messianic. But again, I think to me the best argument really is the context, as you said, and the fact that as I go through it, and I systematically go through it in the book, that each of these passages makes perfect sense of the theme that came before and came after, as this being Israel and the righteous remnant of Israel, and the story of what's going to happen at the end of days when the kingdom comes and how Israel will be justified. That Israel, who all the other nations have looked down upon, who all the other nations have spat on, who all the other nations have rejected, that Israel is going to be glorified and justified, and all the other nations are going to realize that Israel was right all along. And I mean, I think that just fits perfectly in with this entire story of what the servant songs are saying, both before and after. It just fits right in there absolutely perfectly. And for this to suddenly just shift to talk about the Messiah when it's not, there's been nothing in there about the Messiah at all, and it's certainly not explicit, it just doesn't make as much sense to me.
I have a question for you on a two-part question. The first is kind of a minor point, but then I think more substantive question. Under your section on Paul's self-proclaimed apostleship,
Yeah.
You make mention of the exact number of apostles need to be 12, and that was for the 12 the 12 tribes of Israel. And you rightly point out that when Judas was being replaced after the crucifixion, that they chose someone who had been with them the whole time, part of the Jesus Way group, and that they pointedly did not choose Paul. That's a minor point, but Paul was not even a believer at the time. This would have taken place before Paul, while Paul was still Saul, and before he would have qualified for a number of reasons at that time. But also as I'm sure you know, the understanding with Christians is that the 12 apostles are for the 12 tribes of Israel, and Matthias did replace Judas, but Paul was not one of the 12. He was one born out of due season and was specifically the single apostle for the Gentiles. So you have 12 apostles for the 12 tribes, and you have one apostle to the Gentiles. But the more substantive thing is, it says, you were saying, nothing in Paul's letters or Acts suggests the Jerusalem leadership named or recognized Paul as an apostle or conferred upon him any special status. And it seems to me like that's not the case, because you have two different meetings with Paul, with Cephas, Peter, as well as with James, the brother of Jesus. First of all, about 3 years after his conversion. So he's converted on the road to Damascus. He goes to Damascus, then he goes to Arabia, and then about 3 years after the conversion, he comes back for the first time to Jerusalem, and this is recorded in Galatians 1, one of Paul's letters, 18 through and 19, and he talks about meeting with them and basically validating his gospel before them, and also reporting on the conversions that were going on amongst the Gentiles, and that was basically that they green lighted that they basically gave him the right hand of fellowship and accepted that. And then an even more important meeting about 11 or 12 years later, when the Jerusalem Council, when the Judaizers were, as you were saying, you try to imply that maybe this was what James himself was doing as well, but trying to say that you have to be circumcised, you have to keep the Old Testament dietary laws. In order to be a Christian, you have to be a good Jew first. That Paul refuted that and then came back specifically to Jerusalem and met with Peter and with James, the brother of Jesus. And they agreed and actually wrote a letter authorizing him to continue to preach the gospel, and said that we don't have to be circumcised. We don't have to keep the dietary law. And there were only some issues of fellowship, not to eat blood at a table with Jews or to eat things that are strangled. There was some guidelines just as far as table manners, but there was nothing in there about Paul having a different gospel.
Right. Well,
so you have Acts and you have Galatians.
Right. He asked for permission to preach to the Gentiles. And my point is that he was an outsider to this council. He was coming in from the diaspora. He had been preaching these things on his own authority. And my point is, no one at the Jerusalem Council within the Jesus movement appointed him. He had no special, like, Paul is our ambassador. He is, he is, or he is an apostle. The apostle was an important word for the, and the 12 had a certain status within the Christian community. What Paul said is, I'm preaching these things and I want to continue preaching them to Gentiles. The Jerusalem group, the Jesus movement, as I call them, the ones who followed Jesus, who had been with Jesus his life, they were preaching to Jews. They didn't care about the Gentiles. The Gentiles were not on their to-do list. And so when Paul said, I want to preach to the Gentiles, it would not have, I don't believe it would have made much difference to them if he would preach to the Gentiles. And they didn't really care if the Gentiles, well, first of all, you have to also think that you have to also keep in mind that they thought that the kingdom was coming very soon. And they did, and Paul did as well. They all thought that it was imminent. And so when Paul's saying, I'm going to go out and preach about Jesus to the Gentiles, what did they care? There wasn't much time left anyway. And if Gentiles were more favorable and more friendly to their cause, great. But he didn't really he needed them to bless him in the sense of saying, okay, he's not preaching some crazy stuff, because apparently there were people out there, and I think James ultimately and his group were part of this, but who were protesting Paul. Paul was having arguments with everybody. You can read in his letters, he was having difficulties when he went out there. He was getting harassed. And so he felt like he needed them to essentially say, no, we're good with what he's teaching. But that doesn't mean, again, that he has special status within the movement. And my point is that he is the only one who calls himself an apostle. And the only other person that arguably does that is the author of Luke, who was his companion, supposedly. So there's no one within the Jewish apostolic community, within James's group, that gives him any title of significance within that community. Or that
Second Peter, you have the writings of Paul being referred to as graphe, as being scripture, like the other scriptures.
In Hebrews, I think, but I can't remember exactly where that was. But
I think Second Peter.
It's Second Peter, right? But no one believes that Peter. No critical scholar believes that Peter wrote Second Peter. We don't know who wrote Second Peter.
Well, okay, when would you date it then? When would you date Second Peter?
I'm not sure, but I think it would be.
I'll give you the date. Liberal scholars put it as somewhere between 65 and perhaps as late. Highly critical scholars as late as 110, somewhere in that window. Right. So this is someone claiming to be Peter. A letter's been circulated, later canonized, that's saying that the writings of Paul are considered scripture. I would say that's pretty good endorsement.
Well, we don't know who wrote Second Peter. Again, pretty much no critical scholar. I don't know a single critical scholar that believes that Peter wrote Second Peter. We don't know. It's basically an anonymous document that was assigned to Peter.
But in circulation, almost certainly within the first century.
Not almost certainly. I mean, again, there's a lot of dispute as to the dating, and as I said, I would date it in the second century just because of what I've read. But there are some people that believe it was in the first century, but it's certainly not indisputable that it was in the
So
second.
I'm looking at it, says that most critical scholars think it was between 80 AD and 150 AD. So there's a broad range.
Right. So,
But I don't see anything as early as 60.
yeah, but I mean, again, yeah, I don't think it's not considered one of the earliest documents by any means. It's synonymous, and it's
Do either
most of
like
those dates are
You
linked.
think the early church didn't recognize it as being scripture? I mean, you're talking about this predates the gospel significantly. The writings of at least the undisputed documents are letters of Paul. These were in circulation within a couple of years of the crucifixion.
Well, we have no evidence that they did, that the early church that the church in Jerusalem considered anything that Paul wrote as scripture. I mean, the best that we have is Second Peter, which again could be as late as 150 and have nothing to do with any of these individuals, and we don't know who wrote it. So I don't think that's really good evidence of anything. And again, I'm not saying that it's completely worthless, and I understand you could argue to the contrary, but if that's the best we have, that it was considered I guess, when you say scripture, that it was considered authoritative in some sense in, among the Jesus movement,
Would
it
you think
basically
it
died
was
out.
authoritative, at least with the Gentile Christians?
No, not necessarily, no, because again, we don't know who wrote Second Peter.
No, I'm talking about Second Peter. I'm talking about Paul's letters. There was a real historical Paul, and he really did write at least some of the letters that are attributed to him, correct?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. Were they considered authoritative by the early church, or is this something that Paul tried to make it out like it
No, no,
was
no, no, no. I mean,
authoritative?
they would be considered authoritative within the Gentile communities that Paul preached to, and the ones that developed from those communities, of course.
But
But that doesn't
the
mean that
Jerusalem church would have not had any contact or even know that he was doing this,
that he
writing the letter. I mean, within almost no time, you have copies going throughout the ancient world, throughout the Mediterranean and up and down, basically the Roman Empire. And we have copies. We don't have copies from that time, but it was obvious that many copies were made very quickly of that, and it was circulated throughout the known world at that time.
But we don't know that because I mean, we didn't have the printing press. Things were not printed and copied that quickly. I mean, they were copied later on, but we don't know that during the time that the Jesus movement, before James died in 62 CE, we don't know that before James died that there were any copies of Paul's letters being widely circulated. That they knew what he was preaching because they heard, because when he came back, they confronted him about what he was preaching in the diaspora. But we don't know that they had any of his letters at the time or that they blessed them. And in fact, I go into the evidence that I feel like that when they heard what he was preaching, they were strongly opposed to it. They didn't like it. And that I feel like the people that were going around and
Who
agreeing
didn't
with
like it?
him, James and the group within the Christian community in Jerusalem.
Yeah, I mean, you have it seemed. I mean, you could say that the Book of Acts is not is making up the story, but the
I
Book of
do think
Acts does have Peter and James affirming the ministry and actually giving him a letter that he
I
could
do think,
circulate.
well, stop. I do think the Book of Acts was making up the story. I think that
Okay,
was
that
the
story's
purpose of
made
it.
up in the Book of Acts.
I think that much of Acts was for that exact purpose, was to show, and there was to demonstrate that Paul and James were some simpatico on these issues. When you
So
look at the
rather than
letters of
saying that
Paul,
there's nothing in Acts or any of Paul's letters to indicate, might be better to say there are things in Paul's letters and Acts, but they're not authentic. They were added after the fact, or they are not. They were just made up stories.
no, what I specifically said, I think, was that there's nothing in Acts or his letters to indicate that they gave him any special authority meaning that he had the authority that they did, given from Jesus as an apostle. That was my point, that he proclaimed himself an apostle, that they did not, that they did not say that he was an apostle of Jesus, that he, all of that, and his entire message was something that he came up with on his own, that they did not indicate that he was Jesus's, that he had a special message.
So when they were giving him a letter of recommendation, authorizing him to go preach the gospel, they didn't know he was claiming to be an apostle, or they would have never done that.
I don't think they knew he was being apostle. I think they didn't. They also didn't know a lot of what he was teaching about the fact that even Jews did not necessarily have to follow the law. And when they found that out, and again, I go through this, I feel like that's when they begin to go out and they began, and it's in his letters, he doesn't identify them by name, but that they were opposing him and going around and arguing that he had the wrong.
Well, you're right about there was a conflict between him later, between him and Peter, that Peter was being inconsistent, that after he had the vision, Cornelius, and that that it was okay to have a Gentile in your home and things like that, that when in connection with apparently some of the Judaizers, that Peter then refused to have table fellowship, and Paul called him out on that. So there was, I will agree with you, there was a conflict.
That's a different conflict. What I'm talking about is when Paul comes back and James confronts him over what he's teaching and says, you need to go and make a Nazirite offering at the temple. And the purpose of a Nazirite offering is that you're saying that you have to atone for your sins. And if Paul was preaching as he was, that you didn't have to follow the law anymore to atone for sins because Jesus was the atonement. Jesus brought salvation. Then there would be no point in him making a Nazirite offering. The only reason that James would have forced Paul to make the Nazirite offering is to show publicly that he disavowed that message, that he did not believe that Jesus was a savior. When James found out that he was preaching this, he said, Paul, you need to go out and disavow that because that is wrong. That is not what we preach. That is not what Jesus taught. That is absolutely wrong. And you need to publicly disavow it. And Paul did it.
Wow. It seems like you're getting a lot of insight in between the lines of what was happening on that.
No, I mean, that's what Paul says in his letters. I mean,
I was called out by James and had to repent of preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, telling them that they don't have to keep the.
Well, effectively, that's what the effect of the Nazirite offering would be, because otherwise, what would be the point? If you and your group are saved by Jesus' sacrifice, then why would you need to make a Nazirite offering?
I mean, my understanding of that is that there was an attempt by the Jews, not by the Christian Jews, but by the Jews, to be suspicious of Paul even going into the temple, that they thought he was going to smuggle in Gentiles into the temple. And this was a way of showing them that he was able to be observe the Jewish law, not that he was justified by that, but he could placate the Jewish people that wanted to kill him. And that was a suggestion that was given. I don't see how you would come out with that he was called a false apostle or teaching a false gospel, and he had to repent of that, and that's why he took a Nazarene vow.
Well, why that specific? Why specifically that vow? I mean, he could go into the Jewish synagogue and just be there for the service and go through the normal rituals of the service, and that would accomplish what you're talking about. But why would James specifically require him to make this particular offering? This offering, the only offering, by the way, under the Jewish law that would specifically undermine and contradict the message that Paul was talking about Jesus. Why would that be the request that James made of him?
That's just speculation. One of the amazing things to me in the whole study, and we've had atheist authors on both sides. We've had John Loftus, a mythicist. We've had Robert Price, one of the Jesus Seminar fellows, who is also a mythicist.
Don't forget Dale Allison, blessed be his name.
Dale Allison. We've had guest author Bart Ehrman, and he's agnostic, but he's very much a historicist. But the um, the amazing thing is that we can know nothing about Jesus hardly at all, and we can't rely on any of the contemporary or early witnesses of what happened. But now in 2025, we can know specifically exactly why they did that. And it's just like, how in the world, by if we give it another 100 years, we're going to know what they have for breakfast. It's like, how do you know all this information? And even Dale Allison, New Testament scholar, but his two things, when he was our guest at the book club, he was saying that the reason he knew that, it just seems reasonable to me. It just seems right to me. And at the end of the book club, he even said in his 30 plus years of historical Jesus studies, he knows less today about what Jesus actually did than he knew when he began his studies. So maybe you can
I don't disagree with you. I don't
speak to
disagree
that.
with you. I'm not saying that I know anything about this. I mean, we're all, again, we have imperfect information.
Yeah,
We're
yeah.
trying to draw our best conclusion. I don't recall ever saying that I know any of these things to be fact. In fact, I've tried to indicate several times that I don't know that, and I'm just trying to make my
But
best.
John, you have to make a decision. For instance, when Pentecost, where 3,000 were converted the first week, I think, and then another 4,000. Is that legendary embellishment, or did they actually convert 3,000? Because you have these crusades. Remember the Billy Graham crusades, where you have all this support and fellowship in churches, and you still don't get 3,000. So is that made up?
Yeah, I don't think there were 3,000 people converted on Pentecost. I don't believe that.
Yeah. So yeah.
So I think I think, but again, you look at sort of historically, we have historical information about how quickly the Christian movement grew, but I don't think it supports that there were 3,000 people that were.
Okay, let's take a more mundane thing. Peter sees the vision of the animals, what's clean. And he goes, "Hey, man, I've been kosher all my life. I won't eat that stuff." And then it says, "Hey, Peter, it's cool to eat some shrimp and pork. You're okay." Is that legendary?
I don't know. I mean, again, I'm not going to say I know what's legendary.
What's your best guess?
I would say, but I
don't want to speak for you, John, but I don't want to speak for you on that. But maybe would that involve some kind of miracle and make it less likely to have actually happened if it was a vision, or maybe it was hallucination?
No, I mean, people have visions all the time. I mean, and that's why I'm saying, I mean, I don't know. There's no reason for me to believe he didn't have a vision. I mean, you had Dale Allison on. Dale Allison is he's a strong believer, but he very much acknowledges, and I quote him many times in my book, that there were these hallucinations and visions were very common, and they are very common today. And he is, I think, I wouldn't say completely agnostic, but I mean, he acknowledges that it's very possible that these could have just been visions. Because
Well, here's the thing, John. Like at Mars Hill, Paul gives his speech to, the crowd, and it admits that very few believe. So there seems to be some transparency, some historical reliability in Acts, but there also seems to be some. So let me ask you this. Do you feel handicapped that you haven't had a seminary education? I mean, do you know Greek?
No, I don't know Greek.
Then don't you feel handicapped here?
Handicapped is in what? Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say that if it was me versus a Greek scholar on the interpretation of Greek text, yes. And, and my background is not in studying Greek text, or even, I don't have the background that Bart Ehrman has. So yes, I mean, if we're disagreeing on something, he has more expertise overall on those issues. All I can do is, I am a voracious reader, and this is a topic, as James, you've indicated. I mean, once you're a Christian, and once you are deeply embedded in Christian, you have an interest in Christianity. And let me just say this broadly. I think that Christians and atheists who are interested in these topics have more in common than they don't have in common, because we have more in common with people that are Christians and atheists who don't have an interest in these topics, because they
Oh, absolutely.
don't talk about this stuff, right?
That's because they don't
Within
care.
the
They're
first
just living their pastor's faith. They're just going with the flow. They know they couldn't put Jesus in history. I'm not talking about being God, just in history as a
Right.
person, if their life depended on it.
Right.
within
So I
the
mean,
first year and a
Let me
half
tell you, when
of the
you're
book club.
debating, just last week, when Dr. Blevins and I had a thing on the Zechariah 9:9 passage where he's riding to a donkey, he pulled the Greek card on me. When I was talking to Tim McGrew, remember James? He pulled the Greek. They're going to pull that Greek. I don't know if you want to get on the debate stage, whether it's a lot of fun and it's very, it's, I don't know if that's a goal of yours, but if you don't know Greek, they're going to eat you alive.
It's what he's claiming is that all the English translators just got it wrong.
yeah.
He
Well,
by invoking one Greek word, he can set it all straight.
sure. Well, I mean,
There are times that the Greek can illuminate an issue, but also it can be used as a weapon just to.
Yeah.
And Christians do that sometimes, and so does Bart Ehrman. Though he'll pull the Greek on you as well. So,
oh God,
right.
yeah.
Well, and people bring expertise, they use it as a weapon. And
yeah.
Sometimes that's valid and other times it's not. I mean, as a lawyer, I'll tell you, I did medical malpractice for a long time, and I would depose doctors in medical malpractice cases. And I would say, I did not go to medical school, and I cannot, on a general basis, argue with the doctor about medicine. But I can tell you, I can know enough about this one particular issue because I will study my rear end off to learn about it well enough to go into a deposition and competently question that doctor, and in many cases get them to admit something where my client wins millions of dollars because I knew that issue well enough. So it's not enough to say just because you don't have general expertise in an area, you can't comment on it by studying on it. Now, if there's a particular issue, like if it was a Greek translation, and I have someone who's an expert in Greek, am I going to say, well, I know more than you do about that? No. But what I would say is, let me go back and look at that. And because a lot of times I think one problem with debates, especially oral debates, is that you can surprise people. No one can be prepared for every question at every time. I don't care how much you've prepared. But I think, an honest debater would say, look, I will get back to you. I don't know that off the top of my head. I'll go back and I'll look at it and I'll respond to your question over time. And I think that's the best way to approach it. But
a courtroom analogy that I've used for the club, because this comes up a lot of times. Should we even be trying to talk about these things? Because I've had some theological education, master's degree, and I've had some Greek and Hebrew, but I'm not capable of talking with Bart Ehrman about the Greek. I'm rusty on it and stuff. I mean, it's very hard to be on the top of your game and stay at that on even a minor little thin area that you do. So, but the analogy that I use, we're more like the jury. So when we get in here, no, we're not PhDs in cosmology. We're dealing with science. We're dealing with questions like evolution. We're dealing with textual criticism. We're doing all these specialties, and none of us are experts on this in the whole book club, but we're more like the jury. And so a jury is going to hear the experts on both sides and try to weigh out, and it's up to the jury to make the best decision, having listened to both sides. The defense is going to have an expert witness, the prosecution going to have an expert witness, and we've got to listen to that and make our judgment on that. So we don't want to throw up our hands and say, well, until I get a PhD in linguistics, I'm not going to even think about this. No, we're responsible to know, and we're going to function more like a jury.
I completely agree. I mean, you all have common sense and you all have a base level of knowledge. And, the people on here, just the fact that you're here, you have an interest in the subject matter. You've read a lot, you've heard a lot of people that know a lot about these subjects. But again, I mean, this covers, when you talk about Christianity versus atheism or just different religions in general, it covers so many subjects. I mean, again, we talk about cosmology, we talk about philosophy, we talk about history, we talk about, Greek, languages. There's so many different expertises that you would have to be able to be like fluent in all of these
John,
areas.
I wanted to ask you before I forget.
Yeah.
I don't want to lose track of the hallucination
Sure.
topic. I was looking at some of the notes that you had in regards to the psychology of of grief hallucinations. And I was wondering if you had, and I didn't, I could have overlooked it, and I apologize if I did. What are some of the source material of hallucinations from the ancient world? Because it seems like, I'm not saying you're doing this, it seems like a lot of times I would not doubt, given I believe in a supernatural reality, that there were visions and that people did have things, saw things that maybe they were there, maybe they weren't. People have those today. I'm not contesting that. The interesting, or the question I would have is, how does the modern psychology of grief hallucinations of the 21st century apply to texts that are a couple millennia old, where that concept, as we have in modern psychology, it appears to me, in some sense, anachronistic. Like you would apply modern space telescope technology to the way the Jews understood the heavens. They didn't have space telescopes. They didn't have the visions that we did. So it would be anachronistic to demand that they know the science like we know it. How do you see that modern psychology could inform texts that didn't have any idea about this modern conception of what you're calling grief hallucinations? Does the modern psychology actually, are you using that as a hermeneutic to determine what actually happened in the Gospels, or how are you seeing that applied?
Well, I'm using the principle of analogy, which is what historians use, and I've discussed this in the book as well. I mean, if we can't use our understanding of the world today to inform what the world was 200, 2,000 years ago, then we really don't have much to work with. I mean, we're just guessing, and we're in a situation of relatively radical skepticism. And basically, what psychologists have done today is they have done tests to see how the human mind works and what the human mind does in different situations. I don't think there's any good reason to believe that human brains worked significantly differently 2,000 years ago than they do today, or that the psychology of how the human brain works today is not applicable to human brains 2,000 years ago. I mean, what you have in those texts are descriptions of events. And they're always subjective, right? Because when someone writes, and in the gospel specifically, which is what we're talking about, these are third person descriptions. You're not even getting Peter's own view of what happened. You're getting someone else's view of what happened to someone else or what someone else saw. So you're removed, and we don't know how many times removed. I mean, this could be many times removed, because if we're talking about oral traditions, then we can't even be entirely certain of exactly what is said. So I think that, we're doing the best we can with what we have. But I think if you just throw modern psychology out the window, then you really don't have much to use to try to determine what was going on. And I think, and Dale Allison, again, I mean, a lot of this is, Dale Allison did a in-depth view of this, because he really, really dove into this deeply to try to figure this out. He thought this was an extremely important issue, and he researched this deeply, and his book goes into this in great detail. And a lot of what I'm saying here is very consistent with what he said.
Do you think in a court of law, using a court analogy, that you could bring in evidence of something that happened today to speak to something that happened 2,000 years ago, forensically speaking? Would that be admissible in a court of law?
You have to give me a specific example.
Well, exactly this. So in the grief hallucination literature, I think what's missing in modern psychology is that I don't know of any case, maybe you do, where a grief hallucination was followed up with a body missing from the loved one's grave.
But we don't know that a body was missing from the grave.
Well, I think that in the one sense, I hear what you're saying, that we don't have the kind of knowledge that we might have about what happened Sunday at the Cowboys game or something like that. In that sense, I would agree that we don't have that kind of knowledge. But you have said a lot that we don't know. And I think that, to me, it seems like the people who wrote this would know more about the situation that they're writing about than we would 2,000 years ago. So with the grief hallucination, if it's going to stick, I think what would be more analogous would be to find a modern grief hallucination where somebody was experiencing this and their loved one's body was missing.
But again,
we don't have that. That's not in any of the grief hallucination psychology today.
We don't know the body was missing. I mean, Gary Habermas, his whole I mean, when he goes out and speaks, and he's written now 2 books on this issue, but he focuses on the minimal facts hypothesis, which is I'm going to just use the facts that critical scholars, pretty much everyone agrees on. And he doesn't include the empty tomb in that because he says there's just not enough evidence that critical scholars are convinced, or that the majority of even biblical scholars are convinced that that is a fact. We have some information about it, but it is very much speculation as to whether there was an empty tomb.
That's right,
So
John.
I don't think you can just build that into the assumption and say you have to have the empty tomb situation, a missing body, because we don't know that there was a missing body.
That's right, John. That is not a minimum fact, the empty tomb, according to Gary Habermas.
Yeah,
But who's to
we've
say-
had Gary on. He's been one of our guest authors from a Christian side, and he's explained that to us. Yeah, there are the minimal facts argument is you're looking for things that not just Christians, but liberal Christians. If you're atheist, if you're Jewish, if you're agnostic, if you are in the area of antiquities or biblical studies, that this is a consensus across the board. Perhaps you can't include the mythicists, but I'm talking about mainstream in the academy, that they're going to almost uniformly say, for example, he wouldn't say that Jesus rose from the dead is a minimal fact. No, but the idea that some of the disciples thought that Jesus rose from the dead. Now there's a minimal fact. Now it could be explained possibly through hallucination theory. There's other theories as well, conspiracy theory, but yeah, and I think in recent years, I can't remember if it was Bart Ehrman. I don't think it was Bart Ehrman. It may have been John Shelby Spong, has shifted positions on that, where he used to believe in the empty tomb, but now he believes that the body was, you remember who that was?
Yeah, it's Bart Ehrman said
It was Bart Ehrman.
Yeah.
The body of Jesus was probably eaten by dogs or something.
Right. Just saying,
Right,
like John Dominic Crossan.
So John Dominic Crossan, but anyway, sometimes the consensus changes amongst the academy in this area.
I thought John's description, there were several hypotheses that John, that you put forward in your book. I thought some of them were quite interesting, like that maybe Joseph of Arimathea actually had to hurriedly find a temporary place to put the body, and then that was mistaken by the women for where, because then he moved it, I guess, the next day, or I forget the sequence that you proposed, but it seemed, at least plausible to me that could have happened. And if there was a missing body, it seems to me that would be a pretty decent explanation for why the movement took off, because it could have added a spark, added gasoline to the spark of the hallucination. If the tomb was also empty, then that could have accelerated the acceptance of the idea that he actually did.
And Dale Allison says grave robbers is plausible. There's lots of
grave robbers.
By the way, John, someone put on the chat, in Paul in 1 Corinthians, he says 500. Jesus appeared to 500 people, and what's interesting, he says some are still alive today. That you can talk to, that you can check out. Isn't that good enough evidence for you?
Well, it's not. And Dale Allison also covers this in pretty good detail in his book. But it's not, because the fact is Paul was preaching in the diaspora. And when he said, he doesn't give any names, he doesn't give any specifics. How would you, in ancient 2,000 years ago, how would you find these people? Right. I mean, just to say 500 people as a blank statement, and there's some people out there that were there. Well, who? He's not giving you specifics as to where you can verify the story. He's just saying, hey, and it happened. There were a lot of people, and I'm sure there are people out there that can tell you that it happened. That's it. So, and the other thing is, these people, where would they have been? They'd probably be in Jerusalem. So thousands of miles from where Paul was preaching. I mean, he was preaching in Asia Minor and in areas of Greece. These were very, very far, and in time when people rarely left their local community. So, I mean, I don't think that's what he was saying, is by saying there are people that are still alive, that was some sort of indication of credibility, where you can go down and check with Joe at the market and he'll tell you that, because there's no way these people would have plausibly been able to verify that story.
How do you know, John, that they couldn't verify that?
I'm not saying I know. Again, I'm not saying I know.
Well, you just said there was no
saying,
way they could verify that. You just said that.
I'm
There was no
saying that
address.
if these people lived in these communities, as I'm saying, as most of these people did, and they never left their communities, then
But we don't know that they left it. The
There was
disciples
no
left it.
location. There was no names. You can't verify without this.
how would you there really is no way if you don't have names. I mean, how could you verify?
I
Yes,
mean,
that is
be
true.
realistic.
I think the context was it was said as if there would be a uniform acceptance by the readers that they knew what he was talking about. If I said, well, it was one of the greatest cowboy finishes. There was over 12,000
Hey, now,
people
James,
that
that's
saw it.
legendary embellishment right there. Okay.
I don't. Yeah, a cowboy victory does sound like an embellishment to me too.
Clearly,
But
clearly a Dallas resident.
if you say that, then you're assuming that the readers aren't going to push back and say, "What? There wasn't 12,000 people. Name them. Give me the phone numbers and let me
Who
call
would be
them."
pushing back in Asia Minor about an event that happened in Jerusalem? I mean,
Well, why would he mention that? Well, again, the speculation on my part, but it seems like he's saying something that they already know. As you know, there's 500 people. Go ask them if you want to.
but he's not
So,
saying as you know. I mean, again, you're sort of reading into it, and I think again you could read
yeah.
into it, but that's very ambiguous. And if this was a creed, as many have speculated, then he's not even making that claim. He's just saying something that other people have said, and he's just reciting it. So in that sense, he's not even making this argument. He's just reciting what someone else told him.
Why would he
And
write something like that that was false, though? Why would he just make that up?
he's not
What's the
making
point?
it up. He's not making it up. He's heard it. I'm
This
not
is
Well,
saying
how do you know?
somebody-
How do you know he hasn't? How do you know that, John? I mean, you're
I don't
speculate.
know
You're
that.
speculating like it is like this happened, and
We're
I know
all
I'm pretty much
speculating
know it
to
happened.
some extent.
These people didn't leave their homes. Paul just is speculating. He's just naming things, and you're saying things almost like matter of factly, and then when you're kind of pressed, you're like, well, I don't know. So it seems like on the one hand, we can be certain that he said this for a reason. I mean, it's in there. But then on the other hand, you can make up whatever you want to about
Well, I'm
what his
not making it
motives
up
were.
because Bart Ehrman
Well,
wrote
I
an
mean, you
entire
kind of are
well,
because
no,
it's not the stuff that you're saying. It can't be verified. How do
well,
we know
it
that
can be
these
verified because Bart Ehrman wrote an entire book about oral
did
tradition
Bart
and
Ehrman
about
was he contemporary of
people
Paul though? I mean, Bart
about
Ehrman's
people in
2,000
this
years after the fact.
right, but he studied this entire period of time.
2,000
And so
years
when
later. I
yes,
mean, is he an eyewitness to what Paul was doing?
he's a historian and he
Well,
used
I
methods
know,
of
but it's
history to
2,000
study
years
both
later.
of
How do you
Daniel,
know?
I don't
let's-
think that John is making a controversial claim that he is passing on something that he's heard.
John is
Let's
passing on
just-
something
let's
that
just-
he's heard from.
No, I'm
from
talking
Bart.
about Paul. Talking
Yeah,
about
but we
Paul.
don't know that Paul that the idea that Paul couldn't people couldn't verify who Paul was talking about is what I'm talking about. How do we know that?
Well, I mean,
Well,
let's
I think
start
from
back with the claim that John is making that Paul is passing on something that he was told. Do you dispute that?
No, not at all.
So I think we can agree that's progress, so that we can agree on that point. That means that Paul wasn't if it didn't actually happen, that doesn't mean that Paul is making it up or that he's being dishonest in any
No.
way. It's just something that he had been told and he's passing that on.
right. I
Yeah.
mean, many have
Would he
said,
pass it on if he didn't believe it, though? I mean, if it didn't happen.
I mean, people from every religion pass on things that they think is
Yeah, and this
true.
is the speculation that we're speculating of Paul's psychology, like what
Well, I mean,
we couldn't verify these things, like he
Well,
couldn't.
Let's just kind of wrap this whole up. I will go this far with you. When I'm reading it, I'm coming from some presuppositions that to me, I can come in there and see that it makes very good sense to me that Paul was referring to something that he thought his readers would identify that they could actually do that. However, I'm reading that in some of my presuppositions on that. And so, but I think what Daniel's saying is it's a two-way street that um, we both have, and this is one of the things I've learned in the course of the book club, is we can look at the same exact evidence and come to opposite conclusions, based on our preconceived, prejudices. And so, but I think it's a two-way street. I think that both sides do that.
oh,
I wanted to ask John a final question. John, a lot of the people we've had on here, like John Loftus, well, Christianity did him wrong. He got caught in a scandal or whatever. They feel that they just were deluded with Christianity, that it was just uh, they just have a thing against Christianity. What's your goal with your apologetics, writing the book or whatever? Are you a disillusioned Christian, or do you want to get to the next level in I mean, what's your goal?
Great question. So I am not disillusioned in the sense that, I mean, when I grew up, I did not have, my father was a Baptist minister, then went to a Catholic high school where the principal, because I really liked religion, said I should be a priest. I was like, well, I'm not Catholic, but I do really love this study. I love, he just said, you're just really good at it. And then I went to college, and that was the first time that I ran into people that thought differently than I did. And I felt very strongly about my beliefs, and I wanted to be a lawyer. And so I felt like I'm going to be better than them. I'm going to
Was
prove
that
to
in
them.
Arkansas?
No, that was in
Virginia.
Virginia. That was in
Okay.
Virginia. So when I got there, I mean, and I had these arguments with people, I mean, late into the night. And I just remember one day I was researching all of these things because I felt like, I'd taken so much for granted growing up that even though I knew the scripture, I mean, I'd read it and I knew a lot of these and I could cite a lot of things off the top of my head and felt like I was pretty good at that. But when they were bringing a lot of these arguments, especially about science and things that I hadn't really studied, I felt like I really needed to do some research into these issues. And the more I researched, the more I started kind of coming up dry with things that I felt would be really compelling. And I just remember one day, and I very vividly remember this, sitting there, it was late at night, and I'm sitting there with this book going through it, and I just thought, what if I'm wrong? Maybe I'm wrong. And it was a really big moment in my life because it was the first time that I allowed myself to think I could be wrong here. And the more I dug into it, I thought there are some things that I'm possibly wrong about, and then I think I am wrong about. And I didn't like just give up my faith immediately. I mean, I sort of changed my faith in the way I believed and what I believed, but over time I did begin to lose it. But it was a gradual process. But I did not have negative feelings about Christianity growing up. I had no negative experiences, and I don't think when we talk about being deceived or disillusioned, I don't think that, I mean, I'm sure there are people out there that know, that are preaching things that they know to be false. I don't think most people are like that. I don't think the people that I grew up with were like that. I don't think that I think they believed what they were preaching. I think they believed what they were teaching. And I don't consider them bad people. I just think that, as we've talked about here, not a lot of people, even that are believers or non-believers, even sometimes, dig into these issues as much. They don't really go deep into these things and try to analyze what they know and why they know it and why they believe it. They just have been told things and they believe them. And that was, to a large part, what was going on with me. And so I'm sympathetic to that. I think that a lot of people are like that. When I wrote my book, I wrote the book, well, I'll tell you, when I wrote Cross-Examine, the first book, someone had written a review of The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, which I read. And they said, I went into this book hoping for a book on the arguments for atheism and, and juxtaposing those with arguments for Christianity. And that's not what I got. That's not what this book was. And I was frustrated with that. And so I thought, you know what? Someone needs to write that book because I needed that book. There was a time when I needed to understand what those arguments were on both sides. And I needed someone to kind of give me a survey course of what they were and give them, my view of where I came down on those issues. And it wasn't necessarily because I feel like I need to convince people of that I'm right and they're wrong. It was more, this is the book that I would have liked to have had when I was delving into these issues. And it would have helped me, it would have given me sort of a 101 course on what these arguments are that I could have then taken to springboard into learning more about them myself, to go one way or the other. I mean, I don't strongly feel like people, it's bad to be a Christian or bad to be an atheist or bad to be any particular religion. I think there are good people on all sides, and Christianity is not a bad thing. It has many good qualities. I think people have used it as they've used many religions and ideologies for bad purposes, but that doesn't make it bad in itself. But I do think that more information is better. And I wanted to put that book out there with these arguments. So, and obviously I'm giving my opinion and where I came down on them, and how I view them and why I believe what I believe. But that's kind of why I did it. I wanted to accelerate the discussion and move it along so that people could sort of, and the other thing is I was having a hard time finding people like this to have these discussions with. And so I felt like by putting that book out there, it will get everybody sort of up to the same level. I mean, if you're a physicist, for instance, and you want to discuss some sort of physical, some physics theory, you can't have an argument with some guy at the bar because they need to go through years of training in physics before they can even have a conversation with you, before they even understand what you're talking about. So, I mean, I've always wanted more people to understand more about these issues, to just sort of elevate the conversation to the point where we can all have these discussions, because I think that'll move it forward.
John,
So,
what kind of feedback have you had on the book? What kind of response have you gotten?
to this one or to cross-examine?
To this one, and I failed to mention at the beginning, I apologize, that we're dealing with what Christians get wrong about Jesus, which is your second religious book, right? So the first one, I assumed, I haven't read it, but it deals with a lot of issues, not just the Jesus question.
Yeah, and the reason I wrote this book really was because the Jesus questions were, I was getting into these issues in that book, and they were just sidetracking the whole book. It's like, because there's so much about Jesus that would just take us on a tangent, and it would kind of defeat the purpose of that book, which is to provide, like I said, kind of a survey course of these issues. So I thought I'm going to have to do a separate book solely on these issues about Jesus, and I'm going to try to be focused on what I think are the three most important issues, as opposed to try to hit every single possible, question that's ever been raised about Jesus. So that's kind of why I wrote the second book.
So I have to say, I really appreciated the book. Of course, I'm sympathetic to your views, more or less. I thought you were very direct, to the point, without being disrespectful. It was pretty hard hitting, really, and I learned a fair bit of interesting things about the relationship between Paul and the Jerusalem church. I'm still processing that, and like James, I have some questions about that. But the book of James, that does tend to kind of make sense in light of that relationship, when James is hitting back on salvation by faith alone and so forth. So it has some plausibility to it. I learned a fair bit, even though I've studied all these issues in depth over the years. It was a lot of good insight there, and I just appreciated your tone. I appreciate your tone here coming on. I know you've had some flack, but it's good flack, and I'm happy to see the dialogue that we're having.
Absolutely. And Daniel, to your point, I mean, I totally agree. I'm not an expert in this issue. I could be completely wrong. I just felt like, and again, I think my background as a lawyer is that I feel like I can digest a lot of these topics. Not that I'm a particular expert in any one of them, but I'm an enthusiast into this subject matter. And I feel like I'm pretty good at breaking things down and making them simple and explaining them. And that's what I felt like was required in these two areas, because I just didn't see books that would cover what Cross-Examine did and what covers these issues that was out there. There's certainly more in-depth analyses of some of these things in the academic literature that are much more detailed and, and probably more scholarly. But I felt like there are a lot of people out there that aren't looking for that.
Yeah, we go through as you know, through our emails, we go through it's not really a formal process, but we try to find the tone in the book. And I think that was one thing that impressed me when I was going through it, when we were talking about, it didn't seem like you were coming after Christians like some atheists do.
Not at all.
So no, and you were really chill with the questions I asked you, because we didn't know you. And so it was nice to have you, to the voice there. And that's what I said to James. I said, he's not a fisticuffs guy. And then ironically here, what happens to me, I become the argumentative Bill Cluck tonight. I don't know what happened. I think Bill's fired me up. I am not like that, John.
No, not at all. I mean, I knew that.
And Ken, I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. I don't ever talk to you like that. I'm tired. I got back from a 2-week trip from Utah and immediately went from one airport to another to pick up a friend in London. And then I had to run around him for 3 days on a tight schedule. And I haven't really had any sleep and I'm tired. And I spent a lot of time preparing for this. And I think I just got frustrated. So I apologize to everybody. I'm not like that. Well, maybe I am, James. Am I really like that? I don't know. Was that the real me?
The worst in everybody is what I'm going to say on that. So, no. He's not like that usually. And we do try to have respectful. We have had one really, I'm not going to recount it. We had one really, really bad book club.
In person,
cussing in person, yes.
Inebriated. Many people inebriated.
Well, but that is the one exception. And
I'm not drunk. I didn't drink anything.
Yeah, we're not get knockout drunk tonight. So
we're going to make you do. We're going to do a sobriety test on you before we're done with tonight. But
so, John, I want to know when you left the faith, did you immediately go out and find a prostitute and live a profligate? What was your life experience after?
It's so funny because I will tell you that
too much information.
Like when I was younger, I would have thought that was. I mean, I would have told you that's the reason that that atheists they're just hedonistic and they go out and they don't want to believe in God because they want to do all these crazy wild things. And no, my life did not change. Maybe I should have. Maybe I should have taken that.
Julian, do you want to ask your question before we wrap up? Julian?
Can you unmute?
I think Landon also had a question.
Who did?
Landon.
Okay.
Had a question about Pascal's wager.
Yeah, go ahead, Landon.
Oh, yeah, I didn't know. I've always kind of read about Pascal's wager, and I've never actually heard an atheist point of view or a response to that. And I've always just been curious of what you guys would respond to it. Sure.
Well, I think there are a number of responses, but I think one of them would be that I'll just give you a couple. That it's not really a binary. It's not the choices aren't between atheism and Christianity, right? Mm-hmm. The choices are between atheism, Christianity, Muslim, Buddhism, Hinduism. I mean, there are thousands. I mean, in religions that we don't even know about because they don't exist anymore. And there are possibly we could say that there's the true religion is one that none of us are even aware of, right? So it's not like you have a 50-50 chance and you have to choose one of them. It's you have all of these possibilities, and so if you choose one and there's a Hindu version of hell or the Muslim version of hell, and you choose incorrectly, you choose Christianity, it's not like you have no downside, right? Because your downside is that you didn't choose the right religion. The right religion was Islam. Mm-hmm. So, so I think it doesn't take that into account. And another response is God really interested in you making that decision purely for your self-interest, right? I mean, like believing something because of the practical value to you. Is that really what would make, is that what God is interested in? If there is a God, is that what he wants? Is for you to say, well, what's in my best interest? I'm going to believe that.
And John, or what you saying, just to make sure I understand what you're saying, this has come up in book clubs. You can't decide, I don't want to take any chances, so I'm going to believe. That's not a volitional thing you can do. It's you either have the belief or you don't. You can't just turn it off or on. Is that what you're saying?
Well, that wasn't what I said, but that was the third thing I was going to say,
okay,
which goes into the second thing. That is true, and that was going to be my final point, which is that belief is not volitional, right? I don't believe things. I can't, if I were to tell all of you, all right, I need you to believe in fairies right now, and I'll give you $1 billion if you just believe in fairies. Could you do it? I mean, you can't just turn belief on or off. That's not the way belief works. I mean, we all have in our own minds certain things, we have certain criteria that we require to believe something. And before you can give volitional assent to something as a belief, it has to meet those hurdles. Mm-hmm. And you can artificially lower them, but that's just, you can say you believe something, but that's not the same as actually believing it. And you can't make yourself believe things.
For $1 billion, I might tell you I believe it. How about
Right, exactly. You could tell me you believe it, but that's not the same as believing it.
I know. That's a good point.
So that's what I would
Yeah,
respond.
I've always said if somebody put a gun to my head and say, make me believe that the earth is flat, I'm going to be a dead man,
Right. And Pascal's wager is based on, you should believe this because it's in your best interest to believe it, because if you don't, you'll go to hell.
Right.
If you're wrong, you'll go to hell. Well, that's just not the way it works.
I've always seen the wager as being more an issue of just talking about eternity versus time. And so it's an amount. Like if Bill Gates said, I'll give you all my money in exchange for $1, he said, well, that's my only dollar though. Well, it's just a dollar. And it's worth, even if there's hardly any chance that it's true, it's worth the dollar to do it. So I look at it at that aspect of it, but I could also see you would still have to deal with the issue of, even if I wanted to believe, I can't turn that off and on.
Yeah. And if you look at, like, William Lane Craig has kind of used that argument to lower his standard for evidence. I mean, he's made that fairly explicit. He's like, well, yeah, I mean, he basically says, yeah, I mean, I'm willing to believe things I wouldn't otherwise believe because the reward factor is there for me to believe them. And therefore, yeah, I'll believe things that I otherwise wouldn't, because if I do, I get into heaven. I mean, that to me is the absolute wrong way to approach that.
Besides, it's a wager, and Christians shouldn't be gambling anyway. There you go.
Yeah. One last question before we wrap up. Julian had a question in the chat. He said, it was nice to listen to you, John. I want to ask you if you have plans of writing another book on Jesus in the future.
I don't right now. I mean, I will say that I think I've covered what I want to cover, right? And I have gotten emails from a lot of people. I mean, really, I haven't gotten many that are confrontational. I have a lot of questions. A lot of people have asked me questions. And I've had some long conversations with people as well. And I always say, I'll always answer your questions. I will always get back to you, and I will be as honest as I can. And so I've had some very positive dialogues. Occasionally I've been on social media and some people have been, gotten a little bit nasty there, but I think the social media environment just encourages that sort of thing. And I try to just immediately disengage when that happens. But generally, yeah, I don't feel like that there's really anything more that I need to say. I feel like I've said what I want to say on these issues, and so far there's nothing else that.
Well, one of the questioners, Landon, is one of my students at Arlington Baptist University, and he's just offered you a job at the university. All you have to do is convert, and he's going to put you. He would love to have you as one of his professors. So I don't know how that makes me feel, but I do want to say thank you so much. We're out of time. Thank you so much. I have two quick questions. Thank you so much for giving your time to be here. It's been delightful. I enjoyed reading the book. Two things. What kind of law do you practice now? And secondly, do you have any final advice for the atheists and Christians in the room?
So I practice in-house, and I do what's called risk management. Basically, our personal injury cases for our company, I monitor those, and when lawsuits happen, I monitor the lawsuits nationwide. And I used to, until 2 years ago, I was trying those lawsuits, but now I'm in the role of overseeing and managing them, and just going all over the country. A lot of times they're serious accidents where people die. And so it's my job to go in and talk to the people and try to, work with them and figure out the best approach to, to fixing the situation and doing what we can to make them comfortable. And I'm sorry. Oh, and advice.
Final advice.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess my advice would be along the lines of what I've been saying already, which is to do what you guys are doing. You're preaching to the choir in a sense, is just continue to read, continue to study. These issues are important, I think, for lots of reasons, and you can never know enough about them. There's so many subject matters, as we've discussed, where we're never going to be experts in all of them, but that's what makes this a fascinating general subject. Is you can study it your whole life, and you can go down one rabbit trail or another and be the better for it because you've learned a lot about it. And and you're gonna be more knowledgeable. You're gonna be a better person. I mean, I feel like, my sense. I mean, I know as an atheist, you sort of have to find your own purpose, and my purpose is to be the best version of me that I can, and to try to help people and to talk to people and help them be better versions of themselves as well. And I think that one of the best ways you can do that is to learn as much as you can about subjects that interest you, and help other people find other people with similar interests and help them as well. And then sometimes that involves discussion. Sometimes it even involves debate, but that's great, because sometimes you find out, like I did, that you're wrong.
Well, thanks again, and we would love to have you back if you didn't have too bad of an experience to
It was great.
maybe deal with cross-examined in a future book club at some time. We would love
We have
to
a
do that.
book for next month.
We don't have one right now. Gary Habermas, we heard back from him. He's not available until February, I think, or January at first of the year. So we are working on getting a Christian author, but we don't have that. We will get that posted as soon as we are able to. We're wanting to do one in next month.
Well, thank you all. I really enjoyed this. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys, and I appreciate you guys reading the book.